Anyway, so I'm Belgian and I'm an artist, so it's a little bit different than what I usually do. But anyway, I have a project here. That he asked me to talk about, which I think might interest some of you at least. Um, I'm based in Marrakesh since 3 years now, and I have a long story of work. Maybe I worked 15 years as a conceptual artist, working mostly with ephemeral things. But since 3 years, I'm in Marrakesh, and I started working intensively with craftsmen there. Um, So the project I had in mind for many years, and then I started to develop it. Took a long time to gather the money to do that, because I used to work a lot in biennales, art residencies, festivals, and the budgets were quite limited. It was always like maybe 1,000 to 5,000 euro production or something, which is fine to do a small show passing by. But the project I had in mind was a bit more mature, and I wanted to kind of upscale a little. The reaches of it and the depth. So my idea was to rebuild an engine with Craftsman, and I had yeah. Oh really? Okay, then maybe we can try and do that. You have a big USB stick, that would be best. So I'll start with a little story that there is many stories behind that project that got me interested in making an engine with Craftsman, but. One of them, for instance, started with my father. I was 8 years old. I grew up in Africa, in Cameroon. And my father was working as an engineer, and in the north of of Cameroon, border with Chad. He was installing a lot of water pumps, building water infrastructures, and so on. And one day, the Belgian ambassador received a letter, handwritten note, by one of the village chief in the north. And the note simply said, the pump stopped working. Please come and help us. And obviously they had installed this pump, and that's the only way they get water out of the ground. So this village the letter had took probably a month and a half to reach the capital down in the south. And so a month and a half without water. Anyway, my father was dispatched in urgency, and after 2 days of dirty tracks road, he arrived there in this village, and he thought maybe everybody's dead there, and he wasn't sure. He arrived and he saw the pump, and he was actually pumping water out of the ground. So he went to the chief of the village, said, I have the note. It's like, the water pump? He's like, yes, the water pump didn't work, but we fixed it. So obviously he was astonished, It's like, he took two engineers to put that up. How did you fix that? He was by that time quite used to the African magic, but anyway, so he will. And the chief of the village said, of course we knew it would take 6 weeks for this note to come down, so we sent it, but then we gathered around that pump and we thought, okay, what can we do about this? It's a question of life and death. So they had 2 days of palavers, all of the village involved, and they discussed how to do this best. And then they decided, okay, we have to try. So they took a screwdriver and started to open. And the way they solved this is that they took all the kids of the village and they lined them up from 5 years old up in a long queue, and every time they would remove a little bit from that engine, they would just that kid with it and say, okay, using photographic memory, you remember this piece goes there, between this and that and that. And then the kids lined up and they just dismantled this whole engine until they found a broken piece. They had a local craftsman carved it to the identical in a warthog tusk, and they put it back. All the kids went backward, each of them saying where it goes and so on, and they turned the engine on and it went on. Saved the village. So okay, there is a lot of stories like that behind the work I'm about to show today. I knew Morocco was the right place to do this because my first intention as an artist is always big. So my first intention was to actually slowly reproduce an engine. Each of the parts had to be made by a different craftsman in a different country in Africa. It's so huge. And sometimes it's quite confusing to speak of Africa as a whole because it's made of so many different nations. It's hard to speak of Europe in terms now you speak of local productions in Sweden and maybe Scandinavia the best, but then suddenly there it's like Africa, African design. It's like what the hell is that? It's just so huge. It's only we Europeans that can do that. But anyway, so I met so many craftsmen that were interesting, and the craft usually they use speaks a lot of the history, the geopolitics, people having that technique found themselves in a completely different environment because they had to flee war, and hence they use this material. That's not the original one, but anyway, and then they sell it to another customer that inspire another one, and it's just very organic like that. And so I thought if I managed to kind of make an item after now 100 years of heavy industrialization, our relationship with objects obviously changed a lot, and we lost a lot of stories in the process. I mean, I guess that's why we're here today. So if I managed, I thought the craftsmen were actually essential elements in telling these stories. And if I managed to reconstruct an engine, each part of the engine would be made by a different craftsman in a different material, in different context, and then it all had to plug together, it would kind of be a unique item at the end. And I got fascinated by that personally as an artist. So anyway, I thought, let's try to make that object that nobody else could remake. A singularity of sort. And I thought, I mean, at that time to do it the whole of Africa, obviously it's very big. So I came down to Morocco, and I thought I'm going to just start with Morocco. I mean, because it has 3 million craftsmen. So Morocco, 20% of the active workforce is in craft. Minimum wage is $10 a day. Nobody went to school over the second grade. And there's no social security. And there is a lot of kids. So I came to Morocco, and I thought, what engine should I do? I mean, there is so many different possibilities. I was formed as a conceptual artist. I like to think from bottom up and find coherence in whatever choice. I don't like subjectivity. I mean, I'm made full on of subjectivity, obviously, as an artist, but I like to think a concept and understand why I would do that. So I picked up an engine. At the end, I mean, I looked into the Moroccan history, engines, car making in Morocco. I mean, there is no such industry there. But I found one guy. You can go all the way to the first, this one before that. Ah, okay. Well, it's the one I sucked from the internet, so that's why. It's okay. The first image is actually the picture of that car, the Laraki Fulgura, which is, in 2002, the work of an industrial designer from Casablanca. No, you can just time this way. So an industrial designer from Casablanca called Abdelsam Laraki decided in 2002 to make a 100% Moroccan-made supercar. And at first I got very interested by that story, because in the post-colonial context, if somebody decides, Africa is always about making these social engaged projects and sort of Volkswagen for everybody and sort of like, low-key, whatever. And the Africans, I kind of get tired of that, I suppose. But then he thought, how about making the highest end, technical, advanced item possible to show what our contemporary industry can produce? So I was quite excited by that project. So he did that car. I mean, he showed it actually in 2004 at the Auto Salon in Geneva. And, well, it's a perfect, supercar. So, I don't know, 300 kilometers in 2 seconds or something. And I digged further, and it's branded as 100% Moroccan made, but I digged further, and at one point I realized actually the engine is not Moroccan made. And I mean, a supercar is what? But 70% an engine, and then you put wheels underneath and some, So basically the engine was a Mercedes-Benz engine. And so suddenly I got angry, because basically that was betrayal of the whole project. What could have been beautiful there was again the same story as history illustrates the last century. So 70% German, 30% Moroccan made, the cheapest and shittiest part. And so I thought, that's my engine. I have to take that engine, and we're going to try to rework it with the craftsmen, which are 20% of that industry, but nevertheless never mentioned in the margins. Just good to do stuff for tourists. I won't blame tourism here, because tourism is actually what saved craft in Morocco and probably anywhere else in the last century. But I thought that engine is my engine. We're going to finish with this craftsman where this guy stopped. We're going to continue, and we're going to make that Mercedes 6.2 liter engine 100% Moroccan made, using craft techniques that date sometime 1,000 years old. I mean, and Morocco is a very diverse area as well, so a lot of different influence from Andalusian to the French occupants, Jewish, Arabs, and so on. So I had to find that engine. I found it in Riga in Latvia. Some Russian mechanic had put a picture online of S600 Mercedes. I had took a tree, and so there was an engine there. So I went there, I bought the engine, brought it down to Marrakesh and tried to look for a little mechanic, which I found not very far to a small mosque. He never worked anything but this Line 4 engine they have in taxis there. And suddenly I opened my trunk. I mean, that's the picture you briefly saw there. So, that was my mother's car. It's actually a Citroën Picasso, it's quite funny. Put the engine in there, and then opened my trunk and I said, can you dismantle this? I mean, his jaw fell off, and then he was like, as they always say that, I said, sure, I can. So I was like, good. All right, thank you. All right, so this is Abdelatif. You see, an artist comes up in one of these and everything collapses. So anyway, we dismantled that engine, and I hardly gathered budget to do that. Actually, I'd blown the budget pretty much, twice, if not 3 times, by the end of the project. But it was a 9 months endeavor, and I had to find craftsmen to reproduce the 465 parts of that engine. As you can imagine, it's a very complex industrial engine. I mean, V12s are used in F1. I mean, they're probably the most complex engine there is, the most complex industrial, or let's say mechanical object there is. And at the end, it's a very interesting fusion of everything, because okay, there it is. So 100 years of, so many generations of engineers at Mercedes from all around the world succeeded themselves at making every shape of that engine the best they could. And now I would have to dismantle it entirely, which we did, and find craftsmen throughout Morocco. There's nothing more chaotic than a Moroccan craftsman, believe me, to remake every part of that engine. I mean, including the engine block, which is really a big piece in itself. That's what it looks like. So I started to go around the country. I wanted to use every craft, every technique there is in that country, including eventually recyclable materials or more recent, I'm completely devoid of any nostalgia doing this. I'm not interested by the handmade stuff or whatever. It is more about the socioeconomics in the post-Fordist and post-colonial context. But anyway, so we started, bit by bit. I think over the course of 9 months, about 180 craftsmen went through. And I kept on the project about 57 of them. Many of the craftsmen obviously need challenge. What they do is Fordist. They do ashtrays and Moroccan lamps the whole day, the whole week, the whole year, till they're brain dead. So a true craftsman wants the challenge, prefer to do one piece that he has to use all of his skill for. So that was the one I was looking for, and on 180 that turns out to be 57 people. The main issue was the engine block that you can see. We did it in cider wood, white cider wood. So it was wood carved. It implied a lot of different problems, like wood is moving, each material comes with its problems, and we had to solve them all as we went. So we used camel bone. There is 82 materials in the final sculpture. That's all kind of patrons we used to basically, retrieve the right proportions, the place of every hole. Most often, it's 0.5 millimeter precision, and we had to do this with tools that are just really, really low-key, least to say. Anyway, I'll just browse through some pictures of work being done. Engine block in cider. We use cider because it's a wood that doesn't move. We use a lot of sand casting techniques, for aluminum and copper. So sand casting, that Mercedes-Benz part, for example, was very challenging. Some of you may know, but when you sand cast aluminum, when the metal cools down, it shrinks. So we had to cast sometimes like 10 times the same piece to get enough that were good enough, actually, because there's a lot of bubbles too. It's a very unreliable technique. And then slowly reassemble so we get it right. That's made of camel bone. Every gear was remade by hand. Every screw was sandcasted. Pottery, paint. Of course, there is a lot of decorative craft that came at the end. You know that there was several layers of work sometime on one piece. Anyway, so that's more or less what it looks like at the end. You know, gradually the atelier got filled by the copies of the originals. So we had like about 500 parts and then 1,000 towards the end. That's Zelige, terracotta, enamel terracotta. So we had to use the traditions, but we had to break them too. And of course, the whole project is somehow an Oedipus. It's about when you're a craftsman in Morocco, you're at the very lower and the very bottom of this industrial ladder or manufacturing ladder. So trying to reproduce faithfully so we can reassemble it. And if we can reassemble that engine, it means it's 100% well made because there is just no room for mistakes there. If we try to manage to reproduce, you know, a V12 Mercedes, which is at the very other side of the production chain somehow, and reproduce it faithfully, it's almost like you eat the heart of the enemy. So basically, you overcome. They can then move on to something else instead of always thinking of themselves as unable to achieve such things. You know, I mean it's kind of the whole issues of post-colonialism, I guess. You know, the former colonizer has to regain an equality of gaze and trust in himself. That's kind of what we worked on with this. Also, I'm not interested in cars. I don't care about cars. I mean, my father's an engineer. As I said, he always wanted to get me interested in, like, you know, helping debuild and rebuild cars, but I never really was. I got interested in engines because, for me, an engine is an interesting metaphor. It's a poetic metaphor of the world. You have very tiny bits, bigger things, you know. They're very different, all of them. They all have different functions, like the world, but they have to fit perfectly together for that engine to run forward. If you miss one bolt, everything collapses eventually. I think the craftsmen that work with me on this, I mean, they totally changed their lives to work. I mean, they changed my life too. I lived there now. I'm married there now. They understood they were this tiny element in there, in a bigger machinery, you know. And if they work bone, for instance, some Berber craftsman works bone because his father worked it eventually. It's like, you know, when the Jewish people left Morocco for Israel, they left a lot of techniques there. There was a big hole that they left in the society, in the market. They used to work horn, which is much harder to work than bone. So anyway, the Moroccans, this Berber, they took this market with bone. And so the bone, in a way, this material and this technique is his, and it's the essence of what he does. If suddenly it can fit in another part made of wood by another guy, which has another social, you know, history and a whole different, and then that plugs into metal, and that plugs into this, and that plugs into that, then it kind of becomes, in a way, an impersonation of an utopia, that country can actually achieve something collectively. I mean, the Arab world is quite well known to be disorganized and unable to actually combine forces, join forces, you know, collaborate. It's a big challenge in politics as much as in the craft. No craftsman in Morocco ever, basically, these days. I mean, it was like that in the past. They used to collaborate, but not today anymore because the clients tend to pitch people against each other for profit, obviously, you know. So they have to kind of like, and then they become suspicious of the other. They prefer to do a whole project themselves. They're very wary of having another craftsman join in because you know, he might just fuck the whole job off and the guy's going to lose his client, so he better do it himself, and so on and so forth. Doing something with 57 of them. I mean, when I came there and with my V12 engine, I said, we're going to make this. They were like, inshallah, we're going to make this. You're going to see. If you manage to do one bit of that in 9 months, you'll be lucky. I'm not going to manage this. Oh, no, but it's okay. Yeah, can I retrieve it? Okay. All right. So anyway, I'm going to show you a picture of that engine finished. Don't worry. Yeah, we're building some momentum here. Well, anyway, so oh yeah. Okay, that's the crankshaft, for instance. Very complex piece. We had to cut one tree, the whole tree. So it's all about how you orient the veins for things to work. I mean, I guess most of you understand a little bit of these kind of technical difficulties. You can see how much we had to resolve to make this happen. I tried to involve as much women I could too. I mean, women in Morocco work with carpet making, textile, embroidery. I could use embroidery. There was not much textile and carpet using in the engine making, obviously, but so that's the cylinder heads, for instance. We went to the north of the country, the desert past Ouarzazate on the Algerian border. They have fossils there. So they have this ammonite fossil, so 80 million years fossil of shells. And so I went around with a caliper in the desert trying to figure out, an ammonite fossil that had the right diameter to fit a Mercedes piston. And so at the end we found 12. It's good we didn't find only 11. Maybe we could put that a bit further here, no? Trying to not lose my train of thought here. So we eventually managed to reassemble it. None of us knew what it would look like at the end. Each piece of that engine implied a certain material. People often ask me if I chose subjectively like this material for that piece. So, thinking of the overall somehow how it's going to look and the aesthetics or whatever. But it was not like that. It's a really organic process. Finding a craftsman that can do a piece is a challenge. Often I would try to let them decide. So I would scatter all the parts on the atelier and they would come, and choose which part they feel they want to reproduce. They know their material better than I do. And then usually the shape of the piece itself, obliged a certain material. Something that's thin and long had to be made in copper. Something that's heavy and sort of 3D has to be carved. Some stuff could be sandcasted, not everything, and so forth. Anyway, that's the atelier where this happened in Marrakesh. And this is like as we were mounting the engine slowly, probably after 7 months and a half, about. So we had to assemble, disassemble, assemble, disassemble. Every time trying to understand what doesn't really fit, what we have to improve. Then we have obviously to think of a box. I mean, I came with my mother's car. I had to leave back in that same mother's car. So it means I had the trunk of a Citroën Picasso to put it back in, and I had to frame it. So we basically made that box, which is simultaneously a container to transport it and a pedestal to show it, because it's quite a fragile piece at the end, though very heavy. And it had to be insulated for temperature change, because any of the wood elements there's about 15 different types of wood. They would obviously explode and shatter if any kind of sudden change of temperature occur. So, as you can see, the engine would be sitting in the middle there, and then each side fold to close on the engine, or fold underneath if it's showing it. And we had cork on each side too, that spouse the shape of the sculpture to prevent it from being shattered. That's the box finished. Kind of based on the, Ark of the Covenant. I'm gonna get good at this. Alright, so that's the engine finished. Was worth it. So there was several important things. In making something like that, obviously, people would wonder, what's my craft in that? I was directing a team of 57 people, in kind of awful conditions, but with a lot of enthusiasm and an almost rage-like energy by the end of that, because it had to be done, and we knew we could, and we wanted to prove the world we could. Became like very consensual somehow, and so I decided to pay them, because that's an issue that we should address, I guess. I didn't go there for cheap labor. That was not at all the idea. So I decided I was quite wary also of what happens when you overpay, because you corrupt in a different way. So you have to find a right middle. So the way I proceeded is I looked at the salaries of public servants in the country that I considered locally well paid. So a policeman is considered very well paid. So a policeman is $25 a day. So that's the minimum wage anybody had on that project once they had proven that their heart and their skill was aligned with our ideas, and we were kind of like fitting each other. It was that or more. And for example, the Abdelkader is like the foreman of my atelier in Marrakesh now. It's a very, very enormous guy, full of experience. This guy, he's the one that did the engine block in White Cider. I mean, I was quite desperate to find somebody, and suddenly this guy arrived, and then he looks at the engine like that, and at the block, and he says, 3 months, 4,000 euro. So everybody around him goes like, anyway, because you hear that a lot, But then anyway, he did it exactly like that. So he got paid a lot more, and actually when I sold that piece, he got a percentage on the sale eventually. So that's another way I negotiate rare skills, or let's say skills that I can't find anywhere else. So it's kind of unique. If that person wasn't, if I had not met him, probably we had not done this project to the end. So the other aspect was authorship. So authorship is solved simply by, as I'm a contemporary artist, this is a contemporary art world. Now it's crafted as well, and the name of every contributing craftsman is carved at the bottom of the piece, written straight on the work. So basically, that's how we do it. It's a difference, I think, between authorship and branding. That's the work on its pedestal. Yeah, that's the names. And that's some of the men that helped me. They're all part of my team in Marrakesh now. That's Abdelkader. I mean, I'd like you to really be able to share with you the energy, the surviving will, the guts of these guys that have absolutely nothing, and nevertheless carried out this project with a very loving heart. My craft, I think, was to bring the best out of these guys. That was because I had to inspire them and make them believe again that they're not going to be abandoned someplace. Show them I had faith in them, and they could have that for themselves too. Oh, that can't be good. Okay. We just jump over the only woman that was in there. Isn't she beautiful? So that's the belt for the engine, So it was actually made of leather, but we superposed her textile on top. The mechanic, important guy. There is very different ages. I mean, the craftsman age goes from 20 to about 60. So that's some of the finished part, as you can see. There is a book we made. It took 1.5 years to make it, but anyway, you can, if you're interested by that story, I suggest you go and get it. You can find it online pretty easily. And you'll have the full story then. So for example, we decided to finish things inside out. All of these parts fit in this part. I mean, so it's this part exploded, right? Many of the craftsmen were wondering why they had to finish something that nobody will ever see, and how nuts I was to pay for that too. But I thought, I mean, I wanted to talk both to contemporary and Western culture there, because I see a lot of artists today making things that's all about how it looks and how gorgeous and huge it is and whatever. But I was interested more in the intimacy. So what's the story? You know? I find there's my problem with design too, I must say, these days. So like, okay, but what's the story? You know, where's that human? And does that inform us of that? I mean, I don't know. And in the souks in Marrakesh, 20 million tourists a year. I mean, tourism saved craft, but at a price. Obviously, craftsmen can do a great job, and they can, you know, but then if they know that people are never going to open up the thing, or they don't actually care how it's made, they just rush it up a bit. Who's going to blame them? And so it's all perfect on the outside, and usually it's really crappy in the inside. You know, you bring a chair home, and by the time it reaches Sweden, the temperature changes a little, and your chair splits in two. You know, this kind of thing. And so here it was about telling to the Moroccans, you know, maybe you want to reinvestigate the inside, the heart of the society, the spiritual values of that craft and what it actually implies, because that's precisely probably what you can share to the world, and vice versa because this object obviously is half. It's an industrial engine from the West that's remade with crafting techniques from the past. But so I've always tried to make an item, create an object that belongs 50-50 between two places, two influences, two cultures. It's very hard to find that. Usually you can get a thing that's inspired from the other one. Doesn't mean it belongs halfway to the other at the same time. Anyway, it's as far I went with this project so far in that direction. So that's like all the pieces that compose one cylinder head, for instance. So there is a bit of Fordism. Some parts are. The chains, you have to make each thing separately. You know, so sometimes you have some elements where you have a little bit of like production in chain, but mostly it's all unique parts, which for the craftsman was very refreshing. Yeah, that's the book you can find online. Now you know what it looks like. So after that, I basically decided to, you know, I saw the potential of that craft and the energy of those people. I saw the society as well. I found myself very good there, so I decided to move there. I was living in Brussels at the time, so I relocated to Marrakesh and created my atelier there. That's how, I mean, Jonathan came there, and that's how we met, and that's how I'm here. So that's the throne I built for Dragon, called Dragon, the big guy that made the engine block. That's his name. It's not me who invented the name. It's his name there. People call him like that because he's huge. Love gold. And we've worked on other projects since. I mean, for example, this is a recent sculpture we made which combine Indonesian craft and Moroccan craft. I've always wanted to do something that involves Africa and Asia simultaneously. So, you know, hybridizing both techniques. It's a caterpillar engine. So anyway, I don't want to show that too much because we're not just here for that, but I thought just to show that we have, you know, other endeavors going. There is crafting techniques in Asia that had disappeared in Africa, vice versa. We can reintroduce them. It also gives confidence to these craftsmen because they rarely meet. That actually there is a common workforce, you know, throughout that southern hemisphere, and actually whatever they would do and collaborate on might have a bigger socio-economic impact. It's also interesting to work in this case with Indonesia and Morocco because they both have 20% of the active workforce in craft. So the socio-economic problems are the same, and what's at stake too. Anyway, and then I want to come and talk. I mean, yeah, that piece was interesting, I think, because it's the most sort of collaborative thing that happened on that project. It's a cylinder head made of camel bone. It's a 18,000 centimeter cube, so you know, the cylinder head is this size. It took about 4 months to this Berber guy to actually remake it entirely in camel bone and resin, and then this Indonesian craftsman came and stayed with us for a month and a half and carved it over. And they, you know, they started to collaborate, and actually now they just, you know, they're on WhatsApp talking to each other all the time since.
And they don't speak the same language. I'm not even sure what they talk about, but anyway, they're so excited. So I wanted to finish by what we're doing now, and I thought this project is one of the recent developments. I thought that project would be interesting to all of you specifically, according some of the things we talked about, I think, overlap. So Morocco is in a good spot right now, because since the Arab Spring, many of the foreign investment in the other countries went to Morocco, which is the most stable of the region, and really survived that, possibly because it's a king at the top, and it's very stable for that reason. But anyway, so a lot of investment, a lot of growth, and in this case I wanted to talk about Noor 1. It's a solar power plant off the coast of Ouarzazate, so in the desert. The Germans have been trying to do that in Algeria for maybe 7 years, 10 years ago. Never managed because it's so corrupted and sort of complicated, the case of Algeria. But they actually managed to do it in Morocco. And so it's the first phase of a 3-phase project that's called Noor, which means light in Arabic. And with that, Morocco, which is hosting in this November the COP22 after Paris, it's happening in Marrakesh. They're actually aiming at 48% of their energy to be renewable by 2020, which is just enormous. So anyway, that's the power plant. I'm showing this because the project I want to do is actually, just a brief thing about informal economy. I mean, people often speak of developing nations and developing countries, but what's developing is because they usually take the formal economy as a reference base for these studies. So at the end, if you include the informal economy, which sometimes is 80% of whatever's going on, money exchanging wise in these countries, it might not be so developing anymore. Anyway, this informal economy is what we're working on now, I think, because craft is 100% in it. So I found a motorbike, an electric Chinese motorbike, in the street of Marrakesh recently. So it was a small entrepreneur there had decided to import those from Taiwan. There is a local assembly, in a little garage, and they have this electric motorbike going by. Mostly because it's cheap. So this one is worth about $500. The next upgrade would be a Chinese fuel motorcycle, which is about $750. And then the next upgrade is an original Japanese gas motorbike, the T50 series, which is worth about $2,000. A lot of the craftsmen aim for the $2,000 one, even though they don't have money, because it's a way of social elevation. That's how they prove they're actually going someplace. They feel good riding a motorcycle that's actually worth something. So they don't manage to sell these Chinese motorbike very well. And I saw that and I thought, okay, let's work with the craftsmen on that. I'm quite confident this is the first prototype we're making, which is a copy of the Chinese, a Moroccan copy of the Chinese copy of the Chinese copy of the Japanese original. It's a complicated story, really. But hopefully we can sell that to the Chinese soon. Anyway, so that first prototype is nearly finished. When I go back to Marrakesh now, we're going to test drive it. Then we're going to make a medium feature film about its production and the context in which it emerged, including the electric renewable energy by 2020. 3 million craftsmen that don't know what to do. They have a ministry of craft in Morocco. They have no vision whatsoever. All they think to do is produce more and more and more, which really just crushes the craftsmen even more. And so I think this is obviously not the final prototype because it's a very, very badly designed Chinese model. But I wanted to make the copy of that because it's local. But then at the same time now, what we're going to do is we're going to work with the Dartmouth College in New Hampshire in the US. They have the Tech Business School and the engineering school there. And we're going to collaborate in making a second prototype, which hopefully will be commercializable in Morocco, using about 75% craft, 15% 3D printed parts, and then 50% parts of that are locally manufactured in whatever places we can find. Whether it's crews or we'll figure out what they produce locally. But the idea is that it has to be 100% made there, and hopefully cut the costs. And I think also it's interesting to go in a commercial venture this way, because if I do an artwork, it has some kind of impact, but technically they don't really care. I mean, they don't, art is art. I just wanted to add also that there is no difference between art, design, and, all of that is just one thing in Morocco, and probably that's something that we all can think about, because this categorization here at one point gets a bit mad too, But anyway, so I think 2017 we might bring out this motorbike and try to commercialize it there, and I hope it's going to be a success. We're going to see, because the whole study that the Tuck Business School is going to do about the market study and all of that might actually show that you need to sell it first in Europe so it becomes trendy in Morocco, so the Moroccan can buy it, because actually if it's craft made they don't have faith in it at all. They're going to say that's clearly bullshit, might look good. I'm going to, if I won't give that to my wife, she's going to fall and collapse somewhere in the street. But anyway, so that's all the challenge we're facing. Yeah, that's it. If you have any questions.